My name is James. I am 70 years old, and until last Friday, I believed I had secured a peaceful, quiet retirement. I spent my 35-year career hunting down powerful criminals who hid their worst sins inside corporate ledgers, but somehow I completely missed the monster sitting at my own dinner table. At a crowded upscale restaurant, my son-in-law violently grabbed my daughter by the hair simply because she dared to ask a question. His father raised a glass of expensive wine and cheered. I did not yell. I did not cause a scene. I just paid the bill and systematically dismantled their entire existence. Before I tell you exactly how I destroyed them, let me know what city you are listening from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe a father should never stop protecting his little girl. The evening began under the guise of a celebration. We were seated at a prime table in the center of the dining room, surrounded by the low hum of wealthy patrons and the clinking of crystal glasses. Trevor, my son-in-law, had invited us out to celebrate what he called a massive breakthrough for his luxury contracting business. His father, Stephen, was sitting across from me, practically radiating arrogance. Stephen was a local politician who wore his supposed influence like a cheap suit, loudly bragging to the waiter about his golf handicap. I had always found both of them distasteful, but I tolerated them for the sake of my daughter, Natalie. Natalie sat beside Trevor looking exhausted. Her eyes lacked the bright spark I remembered from her childhood. Throughout the appetizers, Trevor dominated the conversation, boasting about a new commercial development project he was bidding on. He threw around bloated financial projections and casually mentioned taking out massive loans to secure the raw materials. Natalie, who runs a successful nonprofit organization and has a brilliant mind for logistics, gently placed her fork down. She turned to her husband and softly asked a perfectly reasonable question about the liability risks and whether they had secured the proper zoning permits before taking on such immense debt. The atmosphere at the table shifted instantly. The smug smile vanished from Trevor's face, replaced by a dark, twisted scowl. He did not answer her question. Instead, his hand shot across the space between them with terrifying speed. His fingers twisted violently into the thick hair at the back of Natalie's head. He yanked her backward so hard her neck snapped back, and she let out a sharp gasp of pain. He leaned in close to her face, his voice a venomous hiss. He told her she had no right to question his business in front of his father, and that she needed to keep her mouth shut when the men were talking. I expected someone to intervene. I expected his father to reprimand him. Instead, Stephen threw his head back and let out a booming laugh that cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant. Stephen raised his glass of Cabernet toward his son and smiled a sickening, proud smile. "That is right, Trevor," he cheered loudly enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "She needs to know her place." Natalie did not fight back. She just froze. A single tear escaped her eye and rolled down her cheek, dropping onto the white linen tablecloth. The sheer, utter humiliation radiating from her broke my heart, but the rage that flooded my veins was colder and sharper than any emotion I had ever felt in my life. I did not scream. Shouting is for people who have lost control, and I was completely in control. I pushed my chair back slowly. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the polished floor, causing several heads in the dining room to turn our way. I stood up to my full height. I am not a large man, but I have spent decades sitting across interrogation tables from men far more dangerous than Trevor. I walked around the table with measured, deliberate steps. Trevor was still glaring at Natalie, his fingers still woven tightly into her hair. He did not even look up at me until I was standing directly over him. I reached down and clamped my hand over his wrist. I drove my thumb hard into the nerve cluster just below the joint. It is a trick I learned a long time ago. Trevor gasped, his eyes widening in sudden shock as his fingers went numb and instinctively released their grip. Before he could process what was happening, I stepped between him and my daughter. I placed my hand on Natalie's trembling shoulder and gently pulled her up from her chair, tucking her safely behind my back. Trevor rubbed his wrist, his face flushing dark red with embarrassment and sudden anger. He opened his mouth to say something, but I did not give him the chance. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my leather wallet. I extracted 3 crisp $100 bills and dropped them onto the center of the table right over Stephen's plate. I looked directly into Stephen's eyes. The arrogant smirk had completely melted off his face, replaced by a look of confusion. I leaned down, resting my knuckles on the table, bringing my face inches from his. "Enjoy the meal." I whispered, my voice perfectly steady and quiet. "It is the last thing you will ever afford." I turned around, placed my arm protectively around my daughter, and walked her out of the restaurant. We did not look back. The heavy glass doors of the establishment closed behind us, shutting out the stunned silence of the dining room and welcoming the sharp, cold night air. I walked Natalie to my sedan, opened the passenger door for her, and waited until she was safely inside before getting behind the wheel. The moment the doors locked, Natalie broke down. She covered her face with her hands and sobbed, her whole body shaking with the delayed shock of the assault. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, letting her cry. I felt a profound sense of guilt. I had seen the subtle signs, the way she always deferred to him, the way she flinched when he raised his voice. I had ignored the red flags because she had always insisted everything was fine. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He is going to lock me out. He has the keys to the house and he is going to lock me out and destroy my things. I have to go back. I have to apologize or he will ruin me." She was terrified of a man who held a fabricated sense of power. What Trevor and Stephen did not understand was that they had built their entire empire on a foundation I secretly controlled. I was not just a retired accountant who played golf on the weekends. For 35 years, I was a chief forensic auditor for the Internal Revenue Service. I tracked down hidden assets, dismantled fraudulent shell companies, and choked off the money supply of massive criminal enterprises. I know exactly how to make a man cease to exist on paper. When Trevor had launched his luxury contracting business 3 years ago, he had been denied every traditional bank loan due to his terrible credit history. To ensure my daughter had a stable life, I had quietly set up a blind trust fund, leveraging my own substantial retirement portfolio to serve as the ultimate underwriter and guarantor for Trevor's corporate lines of credit. He thought he had secured an angel investor. He never knew it was me holding the leash. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed my private wealth manager. He answered on the second ring despite the late hour. I did not bother with pleasantries. I gave him a direct, absolute order. I told him to instantly freeze the joint trust fund, to revoke the guarantor status on Trevor's corporate accounts, and to initiate an immediate withdrawal of all leveraged capital. My manager hesitated for a fraction of a second, warning me that pulling out so aggressively would trigger an automatic default on Trevor's business loans. The bank would immediately seize his payroll accounts to cover the deficit. "That is exactly the point," I replied. "Do it now. Make the calls tonight. I want his financial existence erased before the sun comes up." I hung up the phone and looked over at Natalie. She was staring at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and a tiny glimmer of hope. I reached over and squeezed her hand. I promised her she would never have to apologize to that man again. I put the car in drive and headed toward her neighborhood to help her pack a bag. We were going to get her passport, her jewelry, and her important documents, and then she was coming home with me. The financial guillotine had been dropped. I knew Trevor's company would bounce its payroll by tomorrow afternoon. I knew Stephen's reputation would crumble when the creditors came knocking. But men like Trevor do not surrender quietly. They lash out. They escalate. We were only a mile away from her subdivision when Natalie's cell phone suddenly lit up the dark cabin of the car. The caller ID showed it was her next-door neighbor. Natalie answered with a trembling hand, putting the phone on speaker. Natalie, the neighbor's voice was frantic, breathless. "Where are you? Are you safe? You need to call the police right now. Trevor is in your driveway. He dragged your clothes, your laptop, and your mother's antique chairs out of the house. He poured gasoline all over them, Natalie. He just lit your entire life on fire. The drive to the subdivision took less than 15 minutes, but the heavy silence in the car made it feel like an absolute eternity. As I turned my sedan onto their quiet, manicured street, the sharp, acrid smell of burning plastic and charred fabric seeped through the vents of my car. Natalie let out a choked, terrified sob beside me. Halfway down the block, the flashing red and blue lights of two police cruisers painted the expensive two-story houses in a frantic, aggressive rhythm. I parked my car along the curb a few houses down from theirs, keeping a safe distance. The front lawn of the beautiful brick home I had helped them purchase was a scene of calculated, deliberate destruction. In the center of the wide concrete driveway, a large pile of ash and melted debris was still actively smoldering under the night sky. I could easily make out the warped metal frame of Natalie's work laptop, the blackened remnants of her favorite winter coats, and the shattered pieces of her grandmother's antique wooden chair. The intense heat rising from the pile distorted the air above it, creating a sickening, wavy mirage. Trevor was standing on the front porch, illuminated brightly by the harsh glare of the outdoor security light. He was not acting like a man who had just violently assaulted his wife in a crowded restaurant. Instead, he was playing the role of a deeply concerned and emotionally exhausted husband. He was speaking quietly to a tall, broad-shouldered police officer, shaking his head slowly, and running his hands through his hair in a theatrical display of distress. When he saw us walking up the driveway, he immediately took a step back, moving behind the officer and using the uniform as a physical shield. He pointed a trembling finger at Natalie. He told the officer that she was back, and that he honestly did not feel safe in his own home. He claimed that Natalie had suffered a severe manic episode earlier in the evening and had started destroying the house from the inside out in a fit of baseless jealousy. He lied with the smooth, practiced ease of a career criminal. He told the police he had been forced to drag her ruined belongings out to the driveway to extinguish the fire she had supposedly started in the living room. He said he was simply protecting the property from her supposed insanity. Natalie broke away from my side and ran toward the smoldering pile of her entire life. She dropped to her knees on the hard, cold concrete, reaching out toward the charred remains of her work documents and the completely melted plastic of her external hard drives. Everything she needed for her charity organization was gone in an instant. She turned to the police officers with heavy tears streaming down her face, her voice cracking and breaking as she desperately tried to explain the actual truth. She told them about the dinner at the restaurant. She told them how he had pulled her hair and humiliated her while his father laughed. But her frantic tears, her panicked breathing, and her trembling hands only seemed to validate the fabricated story Trevor had just sold them. The tall officer took a careful step forward, resting his hand heavily on his utility belt, and told Natalie she needed to calm down immediately and step away from the debris. He spoke to her using that slow, patronizing tone reserved for people authorities believe are mentally unstable or under the influence. The trap was absolutely perfect. Trevor had struck first, weaponizing the local police department to label my completely sober daughter as the violent aggressor. If she fought back or raised her voice right now, they would arrest her without hesitation. I walked up behind my weeping daughter and placed my hands firmly on her shaking shoulders, pulling her upright. I squeezed her arms gently, reminding her to breathe and forcing her to stand tall. The tall officer approached me and asked if I was her father. I nodded silently. He suggested that given her current severely agitated state, it would be best if I took her somewhere else for the night. He firmly stated that Trevor had established residency and had the legal right to remain in the home until things cooled down and civil matters could be sorted out by a judge. He handed me a standard white business card with a case number scribbled on the back in blue ink and advised me to help my daughter seek immediate psychiatric evaluation. I looked over the officer's shoulder and made direct eye contact with Trevor. A slow, sickening, and deeply arrogant smile spread across his face. He mouthed the words, "She is crazy," to me from the absolute safety of the elevated porch. Most fathers would have completely lost their minds in that exact moment. Most protective men would have charged up those concrete steps and broken Trevor's jaw regardless of the heavy police presence. But my 35 years working at the Internal Revenue Service had taught me that sudden anger is a completely useless currency. During my long career auditing the hidden offshore shell companies of organized crime syndicates and corrupt politicians, I learned a very hard lesson. I learned that the man who throws the first physical punch usually loses the entire war. You do not destroy a deeply embedded parasite by screaming at it in the street. You destroy it by quietly removing its life-giving host. I did not say a single angry word in my defense or hers. I simply nodded to the police officer, thanked him politely for his time, and guided my devastated daughter back down the sidewalk to my car. I decided to let Trevor keep the house for the night. I let him feel the intoxicating, powerful rush of total victory. He truly believed he had outsmarted us both by using the local law enforcement as a weapon against his own wife. What he completely failed to realize was that while he was playing a petty domestic game of intimidation, I was already restructuring the entire financial board. As I drove Natalie far away from her burning belongings, I began mentally drafting the exact legal documents that would permanently sever the main arteries of his precious contracting business. I let him sleep comfortably in that big empty house, completely unaware that when the sun came up, he would not have a single working credit card or a single penny to his name. I drove Natalie back to my house in complete silence, navigating the dark, empty streets with a cold, singular focus. Once we were safely inside my home, I made her a warm cup of tea and sat at the edge of the guest bed until sheer emotional exhaustion finally pulled her into a deep, restless sleep. I closed her door quietly and walked down the hallway to my private study. I did not sleep a single wink that night. While Trevor was likely sleeping soundly in that stolen house, feeling like a victorious, untouchable king, I was preparing to completely dismantle his kingdom. Brick by brick, I turned on my brass desk lamp, unlocked my heavy oak filing cabinet, and pulled out the thick, leather-bound binder that contained the master documents for the blind trust. A man like Trevor operates purely on arrogance and borrowed money. He drove a heavy $90,000 truck and wore expensive, custom-tailored suits, but he did not actually own a single thread of it. His entire luxury contracting business, his public image, and his inflated ego were all built on a fragile house of cards funded by massive corporate lines of credit. And I owned the table that his house of cards was built upon. During my decades at the government agency, I learned that the most devastating weapon you can use against an arrogant man is not physical violence. It is absolute financial starvation. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, I picked up my phone and dialed the direct extension of the Senior Vice President of Commercial Lending at the regional bank. I did not have to wait on hold or speak to an assistant. When you control 8 figures in liquid assets, the bank answers on the first ring. I bypassed all pleasantries and instructed the vice president to immediately execute the revocation clauses I had secretly built into the original guarantor agreement. I formally and legally severed my trust fund from Trevor's corporate entity. I ordered an immediate absolute freeze on all his revolving credit lines and demanded the immediate repayment of the leveraged capital he had used to secure his upcoming projects. The banker hesitated for a moment, warning me that pulling the financial foundation out so aggressively without giving the client any prior notice would instantly push the contracting firm into a catastrophic default. He explained that this bank would be forced to immediately seize all linked accounts to cover the sudden massive deficit. I replied with a perfectly calm voice, telling him that was exactly my intention. I ordered him to execute the freeze immediately and hung up the phone. I opened my laptop and logged into the secure online wealth management portal to watch the execution happen in real time. It took less than 45 minutes for the bank's automated risk management systems to recognize the total sudden loss of the primary guarantor. One by one, the green active status icons next to Trevor's various corporate accounts turned to a harsh, unforgiving red. His primary operating account was locked down completely. His material purchasing accounts at the major lumber yards were suspended. The high-limit corporate credit cards attached to his name and distributed to his project foreman were instantly terminated. The financial oxygen was completely sucked out of his world before he even had the chance to finish his morning coffee. The true poetic justice of this particular trap was the timing. It was a Friday. In the heavy construction industry, Friday is the most sacred and important day of the week because it is payroll day. Trevor employed over 24 independent contractors, heavy machinery operators, and specialized laborers across 3 different active job sites. These are hard-working, rough men who rely on their weekly wages to feed their families, and they absolutely do not tolerate excuses when it comes to their paychecks. At exactly 2 in the afternoon, Trevor's automated payroll software automatically attempted to distribute the weekly wages from his main corporate operating account. I sat perfectly still at my desk and watched the digital ledger refresh. The massive outgoing transaction was instantly rejected for insufficient funds. A bright red error code flashed across my screen confirming the bounce. Within 10 minutes, my secure email inbox began filling up with automated bank alerts forwarded directly from his corporate profile. I watched the notifications roll in one after another. Insufficient funds, transaction denied, account frozen, credit limit exceeded. I could only imagine the sheer absolute chaos unfolding at his active job sites across the city. Trevor would be receiving furious, panicked phone calls from his foreman. His suppliers would be rejecting his massive concrete and steel orders at the loading docks, leaving his crews standing around with nothing to do. The men who physically built his luxury homes would be throwing down their heavy tool belts, stopping all labor, and demanding their money immediately. Trevor had spent the previous night puffing his chest out, acting like a powerful, untouchable man hiding behind a police uniform. Now he was a publicly humiliated fraud who could not even afford to buy his own crew a cheap lunch. By 3 o'clock, the terrifying reality of his total, sudden financial ruin must have finally crashed down upon him. He realized he was completely locked out of his own company and legally barred from accessing a single penny. He was drowning in deep water, and he had absolutely no idea how the tide had risen so incredibly fast. But a coward like Trevor never takes responsibility for his own failures or tries to fix his own messes. Instead of facing the severe consequences of his actions, he ran crying to the only person he thought possessed enough power to save him. As I sat in my quiet study reviewing the final default notices from the bank, my front doorbell suddenly rang with a series of frantic, aggressive chimes. I glanced over at the security camera monitor resting on the corner of my desk. It was not Trevor standing on my front porch. It was his father, Stephen. His face was flushed purple with pure rage, and he was pounding his heavy fists against my thick mahogany front door, demanding loudly to be let inside. He had come to my home to intimidate me into reopening the credit lines to save his precious son. But what Stephen completely failed to realize as he stood there screaming on my porch was that my financial chokehold was only the very beginning of their punishment. Stephen did not bother to ring the doorbell a second time before he started pounding his heavy fists against the thick wood of my front door. I watched him on the security monitor for a brief moment, observing the frantic, aggressive way he carried himself. He wore his anger like an ill-fitting suit. I walked down the hallway and unlocked the deadbolt, pulling the door open with a slow, deliberate motion. Stephen immediately pushed his way past me into the foyer, breathing heavily and smelling faintly of expensive cologne and stale morning alcohol. Stephen is a man who has spent his entire adult life carefully cultivating a facade of absolute power and prestige. He is a multi-term city councilman and the current president of the most exclusive country club in our county. He is thoroughly accustomed to people bowing to his demands simply because his name is printed on local election signs and charity golf tournament banners. He operates in a shallow world of country club handshakes, whispered favors over expensive cigars, and small-town political bullying. He paced the length of my hardwood foyer, his face flushed a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. He pointed a thick, shaking finger directly at my chest and demanded to know what kind of sick, vindictive game I was playing with his family. He told me that his son was a highly respected businessman and that my sudden decision to freeze the trust fund was a malicious breach of contract that would destroy their pristine family name. I stood leaning casually against the doorframe, watching him throw his carefully constructed tantrum. I did not offer him a seat in my living room. I did not offer him a glass of water. I simply let him exhaust his initial burst of outrage in total silence. When his loud shouting failed to elicit a single flinch from me, Stephen abruptly shifted his tactics. He moved away from righteous anger and leaned heavily into calculated extortion. He lowered his voice to a menacing, gravelly growl and stepped aggressively into my personal space, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me. He told me that if I did not pick up my phone right that very second and authorize the bank to unlock those corporate accounts, he would make absolutely sure my daughter could never show her face in this town again. He bragged about his deep connections with the local newspaper editors and the wealthy, influential women who ran the regional charity boards. He promised me he would spin a vicious public narrative framing Natalie as a deeply unstable, hysterical woman who had maliciously sabotaged her successful husband's career out of petty jealousy and mental illness. He threatened to drag her entire nonprofit organization through the mud, convincing every major donor to pull their funding and effectively ruining the life she had worked so incredibly hard to build. He smiled that same sickening, arrogant smile he had worn at the restaurant the night before when his son had physically assaulted my daughter. Stephen actually believed he had the upper hand in this negotiation. He truly believed that the looming threat of local gossip and country club whispers would force a protective father to surrender. I let his empty threats hang in the quiet air of my foyer for a very long moment. I looked slowly up and down at his expensive, tailored slacks, his polished leather shoes, and his soft, perfectly manicured hands. I asked him if he honestly believed that a man who had spent 35 years hunting down offshore accounts for the federal government cared even slightly about the opinions of a small-town city councilman. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him, forcing him to take a sudden, unbalanced step backward. I kept my voice incredibly low and calm, refusing to match his chaotic energy. I told him that during my career I had seized massive estates from violent drug cartel bankers and frozen the hidden assets of corrupt billionaires who thought they owned the entire world. I told him his local political connections meant absolutely nothing to me, and that his pathetic threats were as empty as his son's currently overdrawn bank accounts. I opened my front door wide, letting the cold morning air sweep into the foyer, and motioned toward his luxury car parked in my driveway. I told Stephen that the financial freeze was entirely permanent and legally bulletproof. I advised him to go home and start liquidating his precious golf club memberships and luxury watches because he was going to need every single penny to keep his abusive son out of bankruptcy court. Stephen stared at me, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might actually shatter under the pressure. He realized in that terrifying moment that he had completely lost control of the situation and that his usual tactics of intimidation were entirely useless against me. He stormed out of my house without another word, his heavy footsteps echoing loudly down my concrete driveway. I closed the door smoothly, locking the deadbolt with a highly satisfying solid click. A deep, profound sense of peace settled over me as I walked back down the hallway toward my study. I felt a surge of paternal pride knowing I had successfully defended my daughter and crippled the arrogant men who had hurt her so deeply. I sat down at my heavy oak desk and picked up my cold cup of coffee, fully ready to plan the next phase of their legal and financial dismantling. I believed the hardest part of the battle had already been won. But just as I raised the ceramic mug to my lips, the sharp, unmistakable chime of my cell phone violently broke the quiet sanctuary of my office. It was not a text message from a concerned friend or a standard call from the bank manager. It was an urgent, high-priority automated alert from the premium credit monitoring service I had established for Natalie several years ago. I set my coffee down heavily on the desk and picked up the phone, swiping my thumb across the screen to open the detailed notification. My blood ran completely cold, and my stomach dropped as I read the digital financial report illuminating the screen. Trevor had not spent the morning crying in his office over his bounced payroll or begging his suppliers for mercy. He had found a massive, deeply illegal loophole to bypass the frozen corporate accounts and secure immediate capital. The red alert detailed that a high-interest, predatory secondary mortgage had just been successfully finalized and fully approved against the primary deed of Natalie's home. The loan was for exactly $500,000, and the funds had already been wired directly into a hidden offshore account, entirely under Trevor's sole name. I stared at the screen, my mind racing, desperately, to comprehend how the lending institution could have legally authorized such a massive catastrophic transaction on a jointly owned property without my daughter's explicit verbal and written consent. And then I scrolled down and saw the attached digital document summary. The rapid loan application bore a perfect electronic verification of Natalie's signature. It was a flawless, absolute forgery executed while my traumatized daughter was safely asleep in my guest bedroom just down the hall. Trevor had just escalated this war from domestic abuse to massive federal financial fraud, and he had firmly placed the crushing debt squarely on my daughter's shoulders. The notification glowing on my phone screen was a declaration of total war. I did not waste time feeling shocked or betrayed. Those emotions are completely useless when you are dealing with a financial predator. I needed a specific kind of legal firepower to handle this massive escalation. I needed Aaron. Aaron was not a standard family law attorney who handled messy divorces and emotional custody battles. He was a former federal prosecutor who specialized in high-level corporate fraud and complex white-collar crime. We had worked together on several massive government task forces, dismantling corrupt hedge funds and offshore laundering operations. Aaron possessed a mind like a steel trap, and he pursued his targets with a cold, ruthless efficiency that I deeply respected. During our time working together for the government, we had sent dozens of arrogant men to federal prison. I knew he was the only person capable of handling this specific level of financial warfare. I picked up my phone and dialed his private number. It was early Saturday morning, but Aaron answered immediately. I gave him a very brief summary of the situation. I told him my son-in-law had bypassed a frozen trust fund by taking out a massive predatory secondary mortgage on the primary residence belonging to my daughter. I told him the electronic signature was a complete forgery and that the capital had already been wired to an unverified offshore account. Aaron did not ask any unnecessary questions about the domestic dispute. He did not care about the burned clothes in the driveway or the local police involvement. He only cared about the paper trail. He simply told me to bring Natalie to his downtown office in exactly 1 hour and hung up the phone. I walked down the hallway to the guest bedroom and knocked gently on the door. Natalie was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the wall. The exhaustion from the previous night was still heavily etched into her face. I sat down next to her and spoke in a very calm, measured tone. I explained that Trevor had made a catastrophic financial mistake. I told her we needed to go see a very old professional friend of mine to sort out a legal issue regarding her house. I kept the details incredibly vague to prevent her from panicking before we had the full scope of the damage sitting right in front of us. She nodded slowly, trusting me completely, and went to get dressed. The drive to downtown was quiet. The city was barely awake, but the towering glass office building where Aaron worked was fully operational. We rode the private elevator up to the 40th floor. Aaron was waiting for us in his massive conference room. The heavy mahogany table was already covered in freshly printed property deeds, bank wire transfer logs, and digital loan applications. Aaron had used his extensive network of private financial investigators to pull the sensitive records before we even arrived. He greeted Natalie with a polite professional nod and motioned for us to sit down in the plush leather chairs facing his desk. He did not offer empty sympathy or useless apologies for her situation. He went straight to the brutal, irrefutable facts printed on the paper. Aaron slid a thick stack of stapled documents across the polished wood table toward my daughter. He pointed to the digital signature block on the very last page. He explained that at 6 o'clock the previous evening, while Natalie was being humiliated at the restaurant, Trevor had finalized an emergency high-risk commercial loan. Because Trevor had ruined his own personal credit, he used the massive equity in the house they lived in. But since Natalie was the sole legal owner of the property, he needed her explicit authorization to borrow against it. Aaron tapped his expensive pen against the forged electronic signature. He stated clearly that Trevor had illegally accessed her personal email account, intercepted the digital loan documents, and executed the signature using her stolen credentials. He pointed out the timestamp on the digital certificate. It proved the document was signed from an internet protocol address located at the luxury contracting office exactly when Natalie was sitting right next to me in my car. Natalie stared down at the paperwork, her hands trembling uncontrollably. She read the bold black numbers printed at the top of the loan summary. $500,000. She read the incredibly high predatory interest rate attached to the principal amount. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and terrified. Her breathing became shallow and rapid as the sheer weight of the financial burden crashed down onto her shoulders. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with sheer absolute panic. She whispered that she did not have that kind of money and could never hope to repay it. She told me her nonprofit charity barely kept enough operating capital to run their community programs, and that her personal savings had been completely drained by Trevor over the last 3 years to fund his extravagant lifestyle. She started to hyperventilate, believing her entire life was completely over. She saw herself losing her beautiful home, going to federal prison for defaulting on a massive commercial loan, and losing the charity organization she had poured her entire heart and soul into building from the ground up. She began to cry again, but these were not tears of sadness. They were tears of pure, unadulterated terror. She asked Aaron how Trevor could have possibly done this, and how the bank could just hand over $500,000 without ever speaking to her on the phone or seeing her in person. Aaron leaned back in his leather chair and explained the vicious nature of predatory commercial lending. He told her these specific lenders do not care about verifying identities or protecting consumers. They only care about the underlying collateral. They knew the house was worth over $1 million. They happily handed over the cash, knowing that when the loan inevitably defaulted, they could legally seize the property and sell it for a massive profit. I reached across the wide mahogany table and placed my hands firmly over my daughter's shaking fingers. I needed her to stop looking at the massive debt and start looking at the incredible weapon Trevor had just foolishly handed us. I told her to take a deep breath and listen to me very carefully. I explained that up until this exact moment, Trevor had only committed domestic assault and petty property damage. Those were local crimes handled by local police officers who were already highly sympathetic to his fabricated lies and manipulative charm. We had seen firsthand how easily he could control the local narrative. But by forging a digital signature across state lines to secure a massive commercial loan and wiring those stolen funds to an international offshore account, Trevor had crossed a very dangerous, irreversible line. He had just committed multiple federal felonies, including wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and major bank fraud. I looked at Aaron, and he smiled a very cold, calculating smile. Aaron confirmed my statement. He told Natalie that this was no longer a messy divorce over a burned pile of clothes in a driveway. This was a federal crime carrying a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. The crushing $500,000 debt was completely terrifying to a normal person, but to a former government auditor and a ruthless federal prosecutor, it was the exact piece of hard evidence we needed to completely destroy him. Trevor thought he had brilliantly outsmarted us to secure his financial survival. Instead, he had unknowingly handed us the perfectly tied noose we would use to hang him. We left Aaron, the attorney's office, in complete silence and rode the elevator down to the underground parking garage. The sheer weight of the $500,000 fraudulent debt was still pressing heavily on my daughter's shoulders, but I refused to let her sink into despair. During the quiet drive back to my house, I gave Natalie a very specific and highly distracting task. I told her to take out a pen and paper and write down the name of every single independent contractor, supplier, and laborer that her husband Trevor owed money to. I wanted her to stop feeling like a helpless victim and start focusing on the exact people who were going to tear his fake empire apart from the inside. When we finally arrived home, I set her up at the kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee and a legal pad. While she began to write, I walked quietly down the hallway to my private study and securely locked the heavy oak door behind me. It was time to hunt. To the average local police officer or a standard bank manager, a digital signature on a loan application is nothing more than a printed name on a piece of paper. It is a dead end that requires a physical confession to prove it is a forgery. But to a retired federal forensic auditor, a digital signature is a bright neon map pointing directly to the exact chair the criminal was sitting in when they committed the crime. Aaron had managed to extract the raw data file of the commercial loan application before we left his office, and he had transferred it onto a secure encrypted flash drive for me. I sat down at my desk and opened the locked bottom drawer of my filing cabinet. I pulled out a heavy reinforced laptop that I had legally retained from my final active years at the government agency. It was not a standard commercial computer. It was heavily modified and loaded with proprietary tracing software that local law enforcement agencies simply do not have the clearance to access. I powered on the machine and let the familiar low hum of the cooling fan steady my racing nerves. Trevor was a creature of extreme arrogance and profound intellectual laziness. He genuinely believed that because he knew how to pour concrete and manage a construction site, he also understood how the modern global financial system operated. He truly thought that hiding behind a computer screen and clicking a few buttons made him completely invisible to the consequences of his actions. I plugged the encrypted flash drive into the secure port and uploaded the loan document directly into my diagnostic software. I began the meticulous process of peeling back the complex digital layers of metadata deeply embedded inside the forged signature file. Every single time a person connects to the internet to authorize a secure financial transaction, they leave behind a unique and highly permanent digital fingerprint called an Internet Protocol address. I watched the green lines of code cascade rapidly down my dark screen as the software systematically stripped away the basic commercial encryptions protecting the document. Trevor had been so incredibly eager to get his hands on that massive injection of cash that he had been unforgivably sloppy. He had not even bothered to use a virtual private network to mask his geographic location or scramble his digital footprint. He executed a major federal forgery entirely in the open, believing he was the smartest man in the room. The tracing software took less than 3 minutes to isolate the exact geographical coordinates, the specific timestamp, and the registered service provider attached to the fraudulent transaction. I leaned in close to the glowing monitor, fully expecting the digital trail to lead directly to the messy back office of his luxury contracting firm, or perhaps the local coffee shop down the street from Natalie's house. But the physical address that flashed across my screen made my heart skip a beat with a sudden rush of cold, absolute triumph. The digital footprint did not belong to Trevor at all. The internet service provider was not registered to a residential address or a commercial construction yard. It was registered to a highly secure, restricted commercial network located directly in the center of the downtown municipal district. I quickly opened a secondary window and cross-referenced the static protocol address with the public municipal registry database. The final result was so perfectly damning and so beautifully arrogant that I actually let out a low, quiet laugh in the empty room. The computer that had been used to commit a massive $500,000 federal wire fraud against my daughter was permanently located inside the private executive office of City Councilman Stephen. The sheer magnitude of their profound stupidity was absolutely staggering. Trevor had not committed this desperate crime alone in a panicked frenzy. When his corporate bank accounts had suddenly frozen, he had gone directly to his powerful father for help. And Stephen, the arrogant local politician who had stood in my foyer just hours earlier threatening to ruin my daughter's reputation, had personally provided his son with the secure computer and the private office space to execute a federal felony. Stephen believed that his restricted municipal network was safe from standard banking audits. He believed that his political title gave him absolute immunity from the law. By allowing Trevor to use his registered government network to forge the loan documents, Stephen had legally transformed himself from a passive, arrogant bystander into an active federal co-conspirator. They had colluded. They had conspired to steal an identity and defraud a commercial bank across state lines. In their desperate, arrogant attempt to secure their financial survival, they had handed me the absolute perfect weapon to destroy them both simultaneously. Stephen thought his local political connections and his country club memberships made him a king in our small town. He simply did not understand that the federal government does not care about local city council votes or golf handicaps. I pressed a button on my keyboard and printed the complete digital tracing report, holding the warm pages firmly in my hands. I had the exact geographic location, the exact time, and the exact registered machine used to destroy my daughter's credit. The trap was fully set, and all I had to do now was follow the stolen money to its final destination. I had the digital footprint proving Stephen provided the secure government network to execute the federal forgery, but I needed the complete picture. I needed to understand exactly why a city councilman and a luxury contractor required $500,000 in untraceable offshore cash so desperately. I left my study and walked out to the kitchen, where Natalie was quietly writing down the names of her husband's business contacts. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee and picked up my cell phone. I dialed a man named Vance. Vance was a highly resourceful private investigator who operated entirely in the gray areas of the law. He owed me a massive professional favor from my days working for the government. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told Vance to immediately pull every single public tax record, property deed, and campaign finance report attached to Stephen's name for the past 5 years. While Vance was digging through the political dirt, I sat down with the legal pad Natalie had filled out. I started cross-referencing the list of Trevor's contractors with the public municipal contracts Stephen had personally voted on during his city council meetings. The pattern emerged almost instantly on the paper. It was a classic, incredibly lazy political kickback scheme. Stephen would approve heavily inflated city budgets for public works, and Trevor would magically win the municipal subcontracts despite having zero actual heavy equipment or specialized manpower. But the profit margins on those basic city jobs were simply not large enough to support the massive $90,000 trucks, the custom-tailored suits, and the lavish country club dinners. There was a massive hole in their finances. Vance called me back 3 hours later with the missing puzzle pieces. He had cracked Stephen's supposed wealth completely wide open. Stephen's political campaigns were deeply in debt, and his exclusive country club dues were actually 6 months behind. He was completely broke on paper. His entire public persona was a massive fabricated lie. I hung up the phone and looked over at my daughter. I asked Natalie to bring me the financial ledger for her nonprofit charity organization. She ran a beautiful community program that renovated old, abandoned properties and turned them into safe community centers for at-risk youth. She handed me her laptop, completely trusting me to look over her clean books. It took me exactly 20 minutes of forensic auditing to find the horrific cancer hiding inside her life work. I matched the routing numbers from Trevor's frozen corporate accounts against the vendor payment logs in Natalie's charity ledger. My stomach twisted into a tight, cold knot as the horrific truth finally revealed itself. Trevor had volunteered to manage the construction side of her charity as a supportive husband. Natalie had trusted him completely with the operational budget. But the vendor invoices he was submitting to her charity for building materials were massively inflated and tied directly to anonymous shell companies that he secretly owned. They were not just simply stealing money from a charity. It was much darker and far more insidious than that. Stephen was taking illegal cash bribes from commercial real estate developers to rezone protected city land. But illegal street cash is completely useless if you cannot legally deposit it into a bank. So Stephen funneled the dirty bribe money directly to his son. Trevor then donated that dirty money into Natalie's pristine non-profit organization under fake anonymous philanthropic names. Finally, Trevor billed the charity for fake construction materials and paid himself the clean-washed money out the back door. The father and son duo had turned my daughter's beautiful dream into a massive federal money laundering machine. They needed that $500,000 predatory loan because the state tax board was scheduled to audit the charity next month. They needed to immediately replace the massive funds they had skimmed before the state auditors realized the community centers were completely empty and the money was gone. They had physically abused my daughter, stolen her home, and secretly turned her into an unwitting federal accomplice to hide their own massive corruption. I closed the laptop gently. The calm, calculated demeanor I had maintained all morning completely vanished. The anger I felt was no longer cold and measured. It was a burning, absolute fury. I took the printed protocol address, the forged loan documents, the kickback trail, and the charity ledgers, and placed them all into a single thick manila folder. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct private cell phone number of the special agent in charge of the Regional Federal Bureau of Investigation. I had worked closely with him for 10 years on massive corruption cases. I was going to hand him a silver platter that would send a corrupt city councilman and his abusive son to a federal penitentiary for the rest of their natural lives. The phone rang once, then it rang a second time. I stood up from my desk ready to speak the moment he answered. But before the federal agent could pick up the line, my entire house shook with the violent, terrifying sound of heavy boots kicking against my solid wood front door. It was not a polite knock. It was the aggressive, deafening sound of an organized tactical breach. I lowered my phone and looked at the security monitor resting on the corner of my desk. My front lawn was completely covered in dark, armored vehicles with flashing red and blue lights illuminating the trees. There were over a dozen heavily armed county sheriffs surrounding my property, with their weapons drawn and aimed directly at my front windows. Stephen had somehow realized his digital footprint was exposed. He knew I was coming for him, and he knew his entire life was about to end. But Stephen was a desperate, corrupt politician with deep, powerful ties to the local county law enforcement. He had pulled every single political string he had left to strike me before I could reach the federal authorities. The lead sheriff raised a heavy metal battering ram against my front door and shouted through a megaphone that they had an active felony arrest warrant for me. Stephen had maliciously charged me with severe corporate espionage and extreme criminal harassment. He was using the local corrupt police force to silence me, to seize my carefully gathered evidence, and to lock me away in a jail cell before the actual truth could ever see the light of day. The heavy metal doors of the county jail slammed shut behind me, echoing with a loud finality. The corrupt local sheriffs had not treated me like a senior citizen. They had treated me like a highly dangerous criminal, pulling my arms roughly behind my back and locking the steel handcuffs tightly around my wrists. They had confiscated my cell phone, and more importantly, they had eagerly seized the thick manila folder containing the digital footprint and the charity financial ledgers. I sat alone on the cold concrete bench of the holding cell, staring at the blank gray wall across from me. The air in the room was stale and smelled of bleach and old sweat. A normal man would have been completely broken by the sudden violent loss of his freedom and the theft of his crucial evidence. But I did not feel fear. I felt a profound, icy clarity. I knew exactly how corrupt systems operated, and I knew that the men who relied on them were always blinded by their own inflated egos. I sat in that bleak concrete room for exactly 4 hours. The local police did not process me. They did not take my fingerprints or photograph me for a booking record. They simply threw me in a cage and left me there to rot in the silence. It was a classic psychological isolation tactic, designed to make a prisoner feel entirely helpless and desperate before an interrogation. But I had conducted hundreds of high-level federal interrogations during my career. I knew the waiting game was just the opening act. I knew exactly who was coming through that door, and I knew exactly what he was going to say. The heavy deadbolt clicked loudly, and the thick steel door swung outward. It was not a police detective or a uniformed guard who stepped into the holding cell. It was Stephen. He was wearing a fresh, custom-tailored navy blue suit, and his expensive leather shoes clicked sharply against the dirty concrete floor. He carried a sleek black leather briefcase in his left hand, and he wore a massive, sickening smile across his face. He instructed the guard standing in the hallway to close the door and give them absolute privacy. The fact that a local city councilman could order a police officer to leave him alone with a federal prisoner proved exactly how deeply the corruption ran in this county. Stephen walked to the center of the small cell and looked down at me with absolute contempt. He seemed to absorb the bleak surroundings, genuinely enjoying the sight of me sitting on the hard bench. He let out a low, mocking laugh and shook his head slowly. He told me I was an absolute fool for thinking a retired government accountant could ever step into his town and threaten his family. He bragged openly that the county sheriff and the local police chief were practically on his personal payroll. He confessed with total arrogant pride that he had ordered the tactical raid on my house specifically to steal the folder of evidence I had gathered against him. He patted the side of his leather briefcase, proudly informing me that the printed protocol addresses and the charity ledgers were safely locked inside his possession and would be completely incinerated before the sun went down. He paced the short length of the cell, his voice growing louder and more confident with every single step. He believed he had completely outsmarted me and destroyed my entire offensive strategy. He told me that my sudden arrest for corporate espionage was going to be the front-page story of the local newspaper by tomorrow morning. He promised me that the local judge would set my bail so incredibly high that I would be forced to sit in this concrete box for months waiting for a trial that he would personally ensure I lost. He was painting a picture of total, absolute destruction, but I simply sat there in silence. I did not argue with him. I did not demand my right to an attorney. I let him fill the quiet room with the sound of his own arrogant voice. When he realized his threats of prison time were not making me beg for mercy, Stephen decided to use his ultimate weapon. He stopped pacing and leaned down, putting his face uncomfortably close to mine. His breath smelled of stale coffee and expensive mints. He lowered his voice to a dangerous whisper and brought up my daughter. He told me that while I was sitting in this cell, Trevor had gone back to the house to deal with Natalie. He claimed that because of the fire incident the night before, Trevor had convinced the local police that Natalie was a severe danger to herself and others. Stephen smiled a dark, cruel smile and revealed that his son was currently having my daughter placed under an involuntary psychiatric hold at a private medical facility. He said Trevor was officially taking over her medical proxy and completely seizing control of her charity organization to protect its assets. The image of my beautiful daughter being locked inside a psychiatric ward by the very man who had violently abused her made my stomach twist into a tight, painful knot. But I forced my face to remain completely neutral. I knew that showing any emotion would only give Stephen the exact leverage he was desperately seeking. Stephen stood back up and smoothed the lapels of his expensive suit. He opened his black leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of freshly printed legal documents and a heavy silver pen. He laid them carefully on the metal table bolted to the wall of the cell. He told me he was a reasonable man and that he was willing to offer me a permanent way out of this nightmare. He proposed a final settlement. He demanded that I sign the legal paperwork immediately, unfreezing the blind trust fund and fully restoring Trevor's corporate credit lines. But he did not stop there. He pointed to the second page of the document. He demanded that I sign over the entire remaining balance of my private retirement portfolio, transferring millions of dollars directly into a hidden offshore account under his name. He promised me that the exact second the ink dried on those papers, he would make a single phone call to the police chief. He claimed the ridiculous charges of corporate espionage would completely disappear and the jail doors would open. He swore that Trevor would immediately cancel the psychiatric hold and let Natalie walk away unharmed. It was a pure textbook extortion attempt, executed inside a government building by an elected official. Stephen crossed his arms over his chest and stared at me, waiting for me to break down and sign away my entire life to save my daughter. He truly believed he had completely cornered me. He had absolutely no idea that I was not a helpless old man trapped in a cage. I was a veteran hunter, and he had just walked willingly into the most devastating trap of his entire life. I looked down at the heavy silver pen and the thick stack of legal documents resting on the cold metal table. Stephen was standing over me, breathing heavily, with a look of absolute triumph carved into his flushed face. He was waiting for the exact moment my spirit broke. He was waiting for the tears and the desperate pleas of a defeated father begging for his daughter's safety. But I gave him absolutely nothing. I simply sat there staring at the blank concrete wall behind him, completely ignoring his demands. In my decades of conducting high-pressure interrogations, I learned that absolute silence is the most terrifying weapon you can deploy inside a small enclosed room. When a guilty, arrogant man is met with total silence, his own massive ego inevitably forces him to keep talking to fill the uncomfortable void. Stephen shifted his weight nervously from one expensive leather shoe to the other. His smug smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. He demanded to know if I was going deaf in my old age or if I simply lacked the mental capacity to understand the incredibly generous deal he was offering me. He tapped his thick finger aggressively against the signature line on the paper, urging me to hurry up before he changed his mind and let my daughter rot in the psychiatric ward. He had absolutely no idea who he was locked in a room with. When you spend 35 years dismantling the financial empires of the most dangerous cartels and organized crime syndicates in the world, you develop a very specific set of permanent survival habits. Back in the late 90s, I was assigned to audit the massive front companies of a highly violent narcotic cartel operating out of Miami. I was frequently dragged into dark, heavily guarded warehouses and threatened by ruthless men who solved their accounting problems with firearms and shallow graves. To survive that dark, brutal world, I learned to never ever walk into a hostile room unarmed. I did not carry a gun because a gun can be easily taken from you and used against you. I carried something far more dangerous and far more permanent. I carried a custom-engineered piece of advanced government surveillance technology. Fastened securely to the collar of my dress shirt, right below my throat, was a dull silver tie pin. It looked exactly like a cheap piece of generic jewelry you might buy at a local department store. But tucked inside that tiny silver housing was a high-grade military audio recording device capable of capturing a quiet whisper from 30 feet away. The device did not transmit a radio signal that could be jammed or detected by local police scanners. It recorded directly onto an internal encrypted microchip that could only be accessed with my personal biometric fingerprint. It was a deeply ingrained paranoid habit that had saved my life on multiple occasions. I had clipped it to my shirt before going to the restaurant the night before, and it was still actively running right now, capturing every single word echoing off the concrete walls of the holding cell. I knew the corrupt local police had illegally confiscated my manila folder and destroyed the printed evidence against Trevor and Stephen. I knew they had taken my cell phone and my wallet, but they had not strip-searched an old retired accountant wearing a nice suit. They had left the silver tie pin completely untouched. Stephen had just spent the last 10 minutes loudly bragging about ordering an illegal police raid, stealing crucial evidence, and fabricating local felony charges. But I needed the extortion attempt to be absolutely irrefutable in a federal court of law. I needed him to explicitly state the exact terms of his illegal bribe without any room for misinterpretation. I finally broke my deliberate silence. I kept my voice incredibly soft and hesitant, perfectly playing the role of a terrified, broken old man. I asked him to clarify the agreement to make sure I completely understood the transaction. I looked down at my shaking hands and asked him if I transferred my entire retirement portfolio into his private offshore account. Would he personally use his elected political office to force the police chief to drop the corporate espionage charges against me? Stephen let out a loud, booming, arrogant laugh. He leaned down directly toward my chest, completely oblivious to the hidden microphone recording his every single breath. He proudly confirmed that he completely controlled the local police department and that the fake charges would vanish into thin air the exact moment the wire transfer cleared his offshore bank. I let my hands tremble slightly to sell the desperate performance. I looked up at him with wide, defeated eyes and asked about my daughter. I asked him if I signed the legal papers unfreezing the massive trust fund, would his son Trevor immediately rescind the fraudulent medical proxy and release Natalie from the involuntary psychiatric hold. Stephen nodded his head aggressively. He stated clearly and loudly that Trevor would sign the hospital release papers the exact second the commercial bank confirmed the corporate credit lines were fully reopened. He bragged openly that they had the chief medical director at the private clinic completely in their back pocket, and that Natalie would be sent home safely as long as I paid the ransom immediately. He had just explicitly confessed to federal extortion, kidnapping by medical proxy, and massive local political corruption, all on a crystal-clear digital audio file. The trap had closed so perfectly and so tightly around his neck that I almost felt sorry for his profound, staggering stupidity. I stopped trembling instantly. The pathetic performance was officially over. I sat up perfectly straight and looked Stephen directly in his eyes. The cold, calculated apex predator he had completely failed to recognize finally stared back at him. I reached out and picked up the heavy silver pen he had placed on the metal table. Stephen smiled broadly, assuming his bullying had worked and that I was finally ready to surrender my wealth. Instead, I calmly placed the pen down on the extreme opposite side of the table out of his reach. I picked up his pristine stack of legal documents and deliberately tore them completely in half, dropping the shredded pieces onto the dirty concrete floor between his expensive shoes. I told Stephen in a voice entirely devoid of fear that I was not going to sign a single piece of paper and that he was never going to see another penny of my money for as long as he lived. The triumphant smile instantly vanished from his face, replaced by a look of sheer, bewildered rage. His face turned a deep, dangerous purple. He screamed that I was a stubborn, arrogant old fool and that I was going to die alone in a federal prison while my daughter completely lost her mind in a locked hospital ward. He snatched his black leather briefcase off the table, kicked the shredded legal papers violently across the floor, and stormed out of the holding cell, slamming the heavy steel door behind him. He walked down the corridor, truly believing he had won the war. He had absolutely no idea that I now possessed the ultimate unshakable key to his permanent destruction, pinned right to my collar. I remained seated on the cold, concrete bench long after Stephen had stormed out of the holding cell. I did not have to wait in the silence for very much longer. Less than an hour later, the heavy steel door swung open again, but this time it was not a corrupt police officer stepping through the frame. It was Aaron. My attorney had leveraged his considerable influence and his deep knowledge of the municipal legal code to bypass the corrupt local magistrate entirely. He had posted an exorbitant cash bail, forcing the local precinct to process my release. The officers at the front desk glared at us with undisguised hostility as Aaron handed me back my wallet and my keys. They did not hand back the thick manila folder containing the digital footprint and the charity ledgers. I did not ask for it, because I already knew it was burning in a trash can somewhere. As we walked out of the bleak county building and stepped into the crisp evening air, Aaron kept his voice extremely low. He informed me that the situation was far worse than a few bribed patrolmen. He had spent the last few hours digging into the local law enforcement hierarchy and discovered that the chief of police was heavily invested in the very same commercial real estate developments that Stephen was illegally rezoning. The entire county law enforcement apparatus was essentially acting as a heavily armed private security firm for Stephen's corrupt political machine. Handing the local detectives any form of evidence would be the equivalent of throwing it directly into a shredder. They controlled the town, the judges, and the narrative. I stopped walking and turned to my attorney under the dim yellow glow of a street lamp. I reached up to my collar and unclipped the dull silver tie pin. I dropped it carefully into Aaron's open palm. I told him that Stephen had just spent 10 minutes in my cell explicitly confessing to federal extortion, money laundering, and bribery. Aaron's eyes widened in sudden, profound realization. He closed his fist tightly around the small metal device, understanding exactly what I had just handed him. We both knew we now possessed the ultimate, undeniable smoking gun. But we also knew the harsh, frustrating reality of the federal legal system. If we simply mailed the device to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, it could sit on a clerk's desk for weeks, waiting to be processed and assigned to an agent. We did not have weeks. We did not even have days. We needed immediate, catastrophic federal intervention. We needed a public spectacle so massive and so entirely undeniable that the federal government would be forced to step in immediately to secure the crime scene. Aaron unlocked his car, and we sat in the quiet interior, strategizing our next move. Aaron reminded me that the town's annual charity gala was scheduled for tomorrow night at the Grand Hotel downtown. It was the most prestigious and highly publicized social event of the entire year. Stephen was scheduled to be the keynote speaker and was set to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award for his supposed philanthropic contributions to the community. Every major political donor, commercial real estate developer, local judge, and wealthy socialite in the county would be sitting in that massive ballroom, drinking expensive champagne. It was the absolute perfect hunting ground. I told Aaron exactly how we were going to tear their empire to the ground. We were going to infiltrate the gala, bypass the private security, and hijack the main audio-visual system right in the middle of Stephen's arrogant acceptance speech. We would broadcast his recorded extortion attempt directly to his wealthy financial backers. The moment those rich investors realized their money was tied to a massive, active federal money laundering investigation, they would panic. They would scramble to protect their own assets. The resulting financial chaos and the undeniable public exposure of a corrupt city councilman would instantly trigger a mandatory federal audit, completely bypassing the corrupt local police department. Stephen would be destroyed by the very same wealthy elite he had spent his entire life trying to impress. But to execute the plan flawlessly and legally, we needed Natalie. As the sole legal director of the nonprofit charity, she had to be standing on that stage beside me. She needed to publicly revoke Trevor's access to her organization and formally request the federal audit in front of the entire town. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed my daughter's number to tell her we were coming home. The call went straight to a generic automated voicemail. A cold, heavy knot of dread began to form deep in my stomach. I dialed the number again and received the exact same result. I looked over at Aaron and asked him to use his private investigator network to ping her phone location. Aaron opened his laptop, resting it on the center console, and typed rapidly. A few minutes later, his face went completely pale. The ambient light from the screen illuminated a deeply grim and terrified expression on his face. Stephen had not been bluffing in the jail cell. While I was locked away and unable to protect her, Trevor had weaponized the local medical system. He had used the incident with the burned clothes in the driveway to convince a corrupt private clinic director that Natalie was suffering a severe, dangerous psychotic break. Aaron confirmed that my daughter was currently locked inside a high-security psychiatric ward entirely against her will. Trevor had successfully executed a fraudulent medical proxy. By legally declaring her mentally unfit, he had stripped Natalie of all her basic human rights. She could not make phone calls, she could not contact a lawyer, and she could not sign herself out. She was trapped behind locked steel doors and heavily medicated specifically to keep her from attending the gala and exposing their crimes. The sheer evil of a husband locking his perfectly sane wife in a psychiatric ward to steal her charity was almost too much to comprehend. The men who had destroyed her life were preparing to be celebrated as heroes the very next night, while she was locked in a padded room, completely alone and terrified. They thought they had entirely silenced her, but they forgot that I was still completely free, and I was coming to burn their entire world to the ground. Aaron and I did not waste another second sitting in the car. We drove straight to the luxury private behavioral health clinic located on the wealthy outskirts of the county. This was not a standard hospital. It was an incredibly expensive, discreet facility where wealthy families quietly hid their embarrassing problems or buried their darkest secrets. It was exactly the kind of place a corrupt politician like Stephen would use to make someone disappear without leaving a messy public trail. We walked through the sliding glass doors into a lobby that looked much more like a five-star resort than a medical facility. The receptionist behind the massive polished marble desk offered a polite, rehearsed smile and asked how she could help us. Aaron did not smile back. He placed his heavy leather briefcase on the counter and demanded to see the chief medical director immediately. The receptionist tried to stall, claiming the director was entirely booked for the day and could not be disturbed. I leaned over the counter and told her in a very quiet, measured voice that if the director did not come out to the lobby in exactly 30 seconds, we were going to call the Federal Bureau of Investigation and report an active hostage situation. The receptionist picked up her phone with trembling hands. Less than a minute later, a tall, distinguished-looking man, wearing a perfectly pressed white coat, walked into the lobby. His gold name badge read, Dr. Keller. He possessed the smooth, arrogant confidence of a man who was thoroughly used to dealing with hysterical family members and making them quietly go away. He ushered us into his spacious private office, closing the heavy oak door firmly behind him. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk, crossed his arms, and patronizingly asked how he could calm our concerns. He stated with absolute authority that Natalie had been admitted under a perfectly legal emergency medical proxy signed by her husband, Trevor. He claimed she was severely unstable, highly dangerous to herself, and required intense monitored sedation for her own absolute safety. He invoked strict medical privacy laws and firmly stated that neither of us had the legal authority to even speak to her, let alone authorize her release. Keller truly thought he was talking to an emotional, helpless father and a standard local divorce lawyer. He was completely unprepared for the absolute legal violence Aaron was about to unleash inside his pristine office. Aaron did not argue about Natalie's mental state or beg for compassion. He opened his briefcase and pulled out the forged digital loan application, along with the geographical tracking report I had generated earlier that morning. He dropped the heavy stack of paperwork directly onto Keller's pristine desk with a loud slap. Aaron introduced himself not as a family lawyer, but as a former federal prosecutor specializing in high-level corporate fraud. He pointed a sharp finger at the documents and informed the arrogant doctor that the man who had signed that supposed medical proxy was currently the primary target of a massive federal money laundering and wire fraud investigation. Aaron explained in brutal, terrifying detail that the signature on the medical proxy was completely legally invalid because Trevor had already committed federal identity theft hours before admitting her. I stepped forward and completely shattered whatever remaining confidence the doctor had left. I looked Keller dead in his eyes and told him that by holding my daughter against her will, using a fraudulent document provided by a known federal criminal, he was no longer practicing medicine. He was actively committing a federal felony. I listed the specific legal charges with cold, absolute precision: unlawful imprisonment, accessory to federal wire fraud, medical malpractice, severe violations of federal civil rights. I told him that Stephen did not control the federal medical board, and his local political influence could not stop a federal indictment. I told Keller that if he did not release Natalie into my custody right this very second, my next phone call would be to permanently revoke his medical license. I promised him that Aaron would personally ensure he spent the next 10 years in a federal penitentiary, sharing a cell block with the very men who had paid him to lock my daughter away. The smooth, arrogant facade completely melted off the doctor's face. He looked down at the damning digital footprint report resting on his desk, and his soft hands began to shake slightly. He was a deeply corrupt man, but he was absolutely not a brave man. He was perfectly willing to accept Stephen's dirty money to lock up a supposedly hysterical wife, but he was completely terrified of losing his wealthy lifestyle and going to federal prison. He swallowed hard, his face turning a pale, sickly shade of gray. He reached for his desk phone and dialed the secure nurse station on the locked psychiatric ward. His voice trembled as he ordered the medical staff to immediately halt all chemical sedatives and to prepare Natalie for an immediate emergency discharge. He did not ask us to sign any complex release forms or debate the protocol. He simply wanted us out of his clinic before the federal government arrived at his doorstep. 10 agonizing minutes later, a heavy security door at the end of the hallway buzzed loudly and swung open. A nurse wheeled Natalie out into the main lobby. She was wearing loose gray hospital scrubs, and her beautiful eyes looked heavy and confused from the initial dose of whatever awful sedatives they had forced into her system. When she saw me standing there, the confusion completely vanished. She stumbled out of the wheelchair and fell directly into my arms, sobbing quietly against my shoulder. I held her incredibly tight, smoothing her hair, and whispering that she was finally safe and that no one was ever going to hurt her or silence her again. I looked up at the large silver clock hanging on the lobby wall. It was exactly 5 o'clock in the evening. The grand charity gala where Stephen was expecting to receive his Lifetime Achievement Award was scheduled to begin in exactly 3 hours. We had successfully extracted the single most important piece of our puzzle. I wrapped my heavy coat tightly around my daughter's shoulders and walked her out to the waiting car. We did not have time to rest or recover from the trauma. We had to get her home, get her dressed, and prepare to completely destroy their empire in front of the entire city. We drove back to my house with the windows rolled down, letting the cold evening air wash away the sterile chemical smell of the hospital. Natalie did not say a single word during the entire drive, but I could see a profound shift taking place in her posture. She was no longer the terrified, broken victim who had collapsed into my arms just an hour ago. She walked through my front door and went straight to the guest bathroom without looking back. When she emerged a short while later, she was completely transformed. She had washed away the trauma of the psychiatric ward and dressed in a sleek, formal black evening gown she had left in the closet. Her hair was pulled back perfectly, and the heavy exhaustion in her eyes had been entirely replaced by a cold, burning determination that perfectly mirrored my own. I put on my darkest tailored suit and slipped the encrypted flash drive containing the jail cell audio recording and the charity financial ledgers deeply into my breast pocket. Aaron met us in my driveway, with his car idling quietly in the dark. We did not have time to discuss the plan again. It was time to go to work and finish what Stephen had started. The downtown Grand Hotel was a blinding beacon of manufactured wealth and artificial prestige. As Aaron drove us past the main entrance, we saw a massive long line of luxury vehicles stretching all the way down the city block, waiting for the valet service. Professional photographers flashed their bright cameras near the double doors, eagerly capturing the arrival of the county elite. These were the wealthy commercial donors, the powerful local judges, and the influential socialites who had blindly funded Stephen's corrupt political machine for over a decade. We absolutely could not walk through those main doors and have our names checked by the private security guards patrolling the lobby. Aaron knew the exact layout of the hotel intimately, from hosting massive corporate legal seminars there in the past. He guided his car down a narrow, dark brick alleyway near the loading docks and used his premium legal access card to unlock a heavy metal catering door. We bypassed the metal detectors and the strict guest list, entirely slipping into the chaotic, bustling kitchen corridor, completely unnoticed by the hotel staff, who were far too busy preparing hundreds of expensive plates to question 3 people in formal wear. We navigated through the complex maze of service hallways and quietly slipped onto the dark, elevated balcony overlooking the massive main ballroom. The sight unfolding below us was absolutely sickening. The massive room was heavily decorated in draped gold fabric and towering white floral arrangements that likely cost more than most people earned in an entire year. Hundreds of wealthy guests sat at round tables drinking expensive vintage champagne and laughing at polite jokes. At the very front of the room, standing behind a glowing crystal podium bathed in bright theatrical spotlights, was Stephen. He was wearing a pristine white tuxedo jacket and holding a heavy glass Lifetime Achievement Award tightly in his right hand. I stood in the deep shadows of the balcony, gripping the brass railing, and listened to his booming, confident voice echo loudly through the state-of-the-art sound system. He was delivering a passionate, highly emotional speech about the absolute importance of family values and the sacred bond of community trust. He spoke beautifully about his deep, lifelong commitment to the vulnerable citizens of our county and how true political leadership required constant personal sacrifice. The sheer absolute hypocrisy of his carefully rehearsed words was staggering to witness. This was a man who had stolen $500,000 from a charity front and locked his own daughter-in-law inside a psychiatric ward just a few hours prior to putting on that white tuxedo. Yet the wealthy crowd sitting below him was hanging onto his every single word, nodding in solemn agreement, and wiping away fake tears of admiration. Trevor was sitting at the premium center table directly below his father, wearing a smug, proud smile and drinking champagne. He was completely oblivious to the fact that his wife, who he believed was heavily sedated behind locked steel doors, was currently standing in the shadows right above his head, preparing to end his life as he knew it. I placed my hand gently on Natalie's shoulder and nodded toward a small illuminated door located at the very back of the balcony. It was the master audio-visual control room overseeing the entire ballroom production. We moved silently across the thick carpeted floor and slipped inside the room. The space was dark and filled with glowing complex soundboards and multiple large video monitors displaying different live camera angles of Stephen speaking on the stage. A single young technician wearing a black polo shirt was sitting in a rolling chair, wearing heavy headphones. When he saw three formally dressed people suddenly walk into his highly restricted room, he stood up quickly, opening his mouth to call for the hotel security guards on his radio. Aaron stepped forward immediately, blocking the young man's path. Aaron reached into his coat pocket and placed a thick stack of crisp $100 bills directly onto the center of the control board. He told the young technician in a very calm, terrifyingly authoritative voice that he was a federal prosecutor conducting an active high-level sting operation against the corrupt politician currently speaking on the stage. Aaron instructed the technician to take an immediate early dinner break and promised him that if he walked out of the room right now, he would not be legally subpoenaed as a federal accomplice to money laundering. The young man looked down at the massive pile of cash, looked back up at Aaron's cold, intense stare, and made the smartest decision of his entire life. He grabbed his backpack, shoved the money deeply into his pocket, and practically ran out of the small control room without saying a single word to us. The moment the heavy door clicked shut behind the fleeing technician, I walked quickly over to the main control board. I pulled the encrypted flash drive from my breast pocket and plugged it directly into the master projection terminal. My decades of forensic auditing had required me to master countless digital presentation systems, and this hotel interface was no different. I rapidly navigated the complex digital menu, finding the active live video feed currently projecting Stephen's smiling face onto the massive screens positioned behind the stage. I loaded the high-definition scanned images of the forged loan documents, the deeply illegal charity ledgers, and the offshore bank wire transfers directly into the primary queue. Then I carefully routed the digital audio file from my hidden tie pin directly into the main ballroom speaker system, setting it to completely override the live microphone feed coming from the crystal podium. I looked through the wide glass window of the control room, watching Stephen raise his glass of champagne to toast the wildly applauding crowd below. He was at the absolute peak of his entire life, completely basking in the adoration of the city he had thoroughly corrupted and stolen from. I looked over at Natalie standing beside me in the dark room. Her hands were no longer shaking, and her head was held high. She gave me a single firm, resolute nod. I placed my finger heavily over the master execution key on the keyboard, fully prepared to tear the pristine mask off the monster and broadcast his true horrific face to the entire world. I stood in the dim light of the control room, watching Stephen command the massive ballroom below. He raised his glass to the crowd and dramatically announced that it was time to play a short video tribute highlighting his decades of public service and charitable contributions. The massive crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling dimmed perfectly on cue. The audience settled into a respectful hush, completely ready to swallow another carefully manufactured lie. Stephen turned his back to the crowd and looked up at the 3 towering projection screens hung across the back of the stage. He struck a humble pose, waiting for the soaring orchestral music and the flattering photographs to begin. I looked at Natalie one last time. She did not blink. I pressed my finger down heavily on the master execution key. The glowing screens behind the stage did not fade into a beautiful montage of local charity events or ribbon-cutting ceremonies. Instead, the massive displays flashed with the stark, blinding white light of raw financial data. In towering high definition, I projected the exact forged commercial loan document that Trevor had executed the night before. I magnified the fraudulent digital signature so it was 10 feet tall for the entire room to see. Right next to it, I projected the deeply illegal routing numbers and the heavily inflated vendor invoices, proving how they had systematically drained my daughter's non-profit organization. For a few agonizing seconds, the wealthy audience simply sat there in total silence. They were completely confused, believing this was some sort of terrible technical error. Stephen squinted at the giant screens, his polite smile faltering as his brain desperately tried to process why his highly guarded banking secrets were suddenly being broadcast to the entire county. And then the audio began to play. I had carefully boosted the equalizer settings on the soundboard to ensure every single syllable of my hidden recording was crystal clear. The heavy state of the art subwoofers vibrated the floor as Stephen's arrogant, gravelly voice echoed out of the massive speakers. But it was not the smooth, polished voice of a politician talking about family values. It was the vicious, cruel voice of a desperate criminal standing in a cold holding cell. The entire ballroom heard him loudly brag about controlling the local police chief and orchestrating an illegal tactical raid. They heard him explicitly demand that I sign over my entire retirement portfolio into his private offshore account. They heard him proudly confess to stealing the charity funds and laundering kickbacks from the commercial real estate developers sitting right there in the audience. But the absolute final nail in his coffin was when the recording played the part about my daughter. The wealthy socialites and influential judges listened in complete horrified silence as Stephen gleefully confirmed that his son had locked his perfectly sane wife inside a psychiatric ward using a fake medical proxy just to steal her remaining assets. The sheer visceral cruelty of his recorded words completely destroyed the fragile illusion of the elegant white tuxedo he was wearing on stage. The reaction in the ballroom was not a slow murmur. It was an instant explosive shockwave of absolute panic and fury. These were wealthy, powerful investors who cared deeply about their public image and their financial portfolios. The moment they heard their own commercial real estate projects explicitly named as federal money laundering fronts, they realized they were deeply implicated in a massive federal crime. Several major political donors immediately stood up from their tables, shouting furiously at the stage. The elegant crystal glasses shattered against the floor as people scrambled to distance themselves from the radioactive politician. Men in expensive suits pulled out their cell phones, frantically dialing their private attorneys and screaming at their financial advisors to pull all their capital out of Stephen's municipal projects immediately. Stephen stood frozen behind the crystal podium, gripping the sides so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. The confident, powerful man had been entirely erased. He stared out at the sea of angry, betrayed faces, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his sudden public destruction. He looked wildly up at the projection control booth, but the heavily tinted glass prevented him from seeing the man who had just ended his life. He was entirely alone on that stage, drowning in his own arrogance. I walked out of the control room and joined Natalie and Aaron on the dark balcony to watch the absolute chaos unfold below. The crowd was beginning to swarm the stage, demanding answers and threatening lawsuits. Security guards were rushing down the aisles, desperately trying to restore order, but the wealthy mob was completely out of control. I felt a deep, satisfying sense of closure, watching Stephen completely collapse under the crushing weight of his own terrible sins. But my 35 years of hunting financial predators taught me that the job is never truly finished until every single rat is securely trapped. I leaned over the brass railing and carefully scanned the panicked, swarming crowd, looking for the son who had started this entire war. I checked the premium center table where Trevor had been sitting just 5 minutes ago. His chair was empty, and his champagne glass was knocked over onto the white tablecloth. I quickly tracked my eyes across the chaotic ballroom floor, watching the frantic movements of the wealthy guests. Then I saw him. While his father was being verbally torn apart by the furious crowd, Trevor was not rushing to the stage to defend him. Trevor was a coward who only cared about his own survival. I spotted him slipping quickly through a pair of heavy service doors at the very back of the ballroom, avoiding the main lobby entirely. He was running. He realized that the federal government would be kicking down their doors before the night was over, and that all their domestic accounts would be instantly frozen by the authorities. He was heading straight for the only lifeline he had left. I knew exactly where he was going. He was rushing to this massive private bank downtown to empty his highly secure offshore safety deposit box before the federal warrants could be legally executed. He thought he could grab the stolen cash and disappear into the night, leaving his father to take the entire fall. He had absolutely no idea that I had already anticipated his desperate, cowardly escape, and that my final devastating trap was already waiting for him in the dark. I stood on the balcony and watched the pristine world of City Councilman Stephen completely collapse into a violent, chaotic mob. The wealthy, influential guests who had been applauding him just moments ago were now practically climbing over the tables to reach the stage. Men in expensive tuxedos were shouting furiously, pointing fingers and demanding the immediate return of their investments. They were no longer a polite high society crowd. They were a pack of terrified wolves who had just realized their golden goose was actually a federal trap. Stephen tried to step backward away from the crystal podium, but a group of massive commercial real estate developers physically blocked the stage stairs. They surrounded him completely, cutting off any possible avenue of escape. They grabbed at his expensive white tuxedo jacket, demanding answers and threatening to physically destroy him if the federal authorities froze their commercial accounts. Stephen was trapped, entirely engulfed by the very same corrupt machine he had spent his entire life building. While the angry mob descended upon the father, I kept my eyes entirely focused on the cowardly son. I watched Trevor slip through the heavy wooden service doors at the very back of the ballroom. He did not look back a single time to see if his father was safe. He was operating on pure blind panic. A younger, more impulsive man might have sprinted down the stairs and chased him through the dark hotel kitchen, trying to tackle him to the floor in a dramatic physical confrontation. But I am not a young, impulsive man, and I do not engage in foot chases. During my 35 years hunting white-collar criminals, I learned that you never run after a desperate man. You simply figure out where he is desperately running to, and you calmly wait for him to arrive. I knew exactly where Trevor was going. He was completely locked out of his corporate accounts, and his local credit lines were entirely frozen. His only remaining financial lifeline was the physical safety deposit box located inside the massive private commercial bank in the center of the downtown financial district. He kept his emergency offshore routing numbers, digital hardware wallets, and whatever untraceable street cash he had left completely hidden in that steel box. He was rushing there right now, hoping to empty the vault and flee the state before the local police could untangle the absolute chaos unfolding at the gala. I turned away from the balcony railing and gently placed my hand on my daughter's arm. I told Natalie and Aaron that our work at the hotel was entirely finished. We turned our backs on the screaming crowd and walked quietly out of the dark audio-visual control room. We retraced our steps through the labyrinth of service hallways, slipping back out the heavy metal catering door and into the cool, crisp night air. The contrast between the deafening, chaotic ballroom and the quiet brick alleyway was incredibly jarring but deeply peaceful. Aaron unlocked his car, and we climbed inside, leaving the flashing cameras and the ruined gala far behind us. Aaron started the engine, and I gave him the exact address of the downtown commercial bank. We did not speed through the city streets or run red lights. We drove at a perfectly legal, measured pace, navigating the quiet downtown corridors. Trevor was likely breaking every single traffic law in the city right now, sweating profusely and gripping his steering wheel in sheer terror. Let him panic. Let his heart pound in his chest. A panicked criminal always makes fatal mistakes, and Trevor was currently driving blindly into the most fatal mistake of his entire life. We arrived at the financial district just as a light evening rain began to fall, slicking the dark asphalt. The massive commercial bank building towered over the empty street, its heavy glass doors locked securely for the night. Aaron parallel parked his car directly across the street from the main entrance, pulling quietly into the deep shadows cast by a large oak tree. I rolled down my window slightly, letting the cool, damp air fill the cabin of the car. We sat in the dark, completely silent, and simply watched the front of the bank. Less than 5 minutes later, a heavy black luxury truck came speeding around the corner, its tires screeching loudly against the wet pavement. It was Trevor. He aggressively hopped the curb and parked his massive truck illegally right on the sidewalk, directly in front of the bank's heavy glass doors. He practically fell out of the driver's seat, leaving the engine running and the driver's side door completely wide open. He was completely frantic. He ran up to the secure automated keypad next to the entrance and began frantically punching in his premium after-hours access code. I watched him through the windshield of Aaron's car, my breathing perfectly slow and steady. Natalie sat in the back seat, leaning forward slightly to watch the man who had tormented her completely unravel in real time. Trevor finally managed to type the correct passcode, and the heavy electronic lock buzzed loudly, granting him access to the quiet, dark lobby. He pulled the glass door open and disappeared into the building, sprinting aggressively toward the subterranean vault elevators. He truly believed he had made it in time. He truly believed he was about to grab his stolen money and walk away completely scot-free, leaving my daughter with $500,000 in fraudulent debt. He had absolutely no idea that I had not just been sitting in a jail cell earlier that afternoon. He did not know that the exact moment Aaron had bailed me out, I had sent the complete digital footprint of the forged loan document directly to my old division at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I knew that the federal government moves incredibly fast when millions of dollars of commercial bank fraud are fully documented and handed to them on a silver platter. I sat comfortably in the passenger seat, resting my hands quietly in my lap, and kept my eyes entirely focused on the glass doors. I knew we only had to wait a few more minutes for the final trap to aggressively snap shut, entirely crushing him from the inside out. Aaron kept the engine of the car running quietly while we watched through the rain-slicked windshield. We could clearly see the brightly lit lobby of the bank through the massive glass windows. Trevor was practically sprinting across the polished marble floor, leaving wet, muddy footprints in his wake. He slammed his hand against the call button for the secure private elevator that led directly down to the subterranean vault level. He was moving with the frantic, desperate energy of a cornered animal. In his mind, he was only a few minutes away from total salvation. He believed that the thick steel walls of the vault would protect his stolen wealth, and that the untraceable offshore routing numbers hidden inside his safety deposit box would buy him a brand new life in a country that did not have an extradition treaty with the United States. He watched the digital floor indicator above the elevator slowly tick downward, completely unaware that he was riding directly into his own permanent grave. Trevor did not know that the federal legal system operates on two entirely different tracks. He thought that because the public scandal had just erupted at the gala upstairs, the authorities would need weeks to build a case, gather subpoenas, and locate his assets. He was acting under the arrogant assumption that he was outsmarting a slow-moving local bureaucracy. But Trevor was not dealing with a local police detective. He was dealing with a 35-year veteran of the Internal Revenue Service. What Trevor and Stephen did not understand was that I had not started investigating them this morning. The sudden violent incident at the restaurant where Trevor pulled my daughter's hair was simply the explosive catalyst that made me decide to completely destroy their lives. But I had already known they were stealing from her. 3 days before the dinner, I had received a routine quarterly statement for the blind trust I used to underwrite his contracting business. My trained eyes had instantly caught a series of highly suspicious inflated material invoices. I did not confront him or ask my daughter about it. I simply did what I spent my entire career doing. I quietly pulled the tax filings, followed the money, and uncovered the massive charity money laundering scheme on my own. 2 days ago, while Trevor was busy picking out his expensive suit for the gala, I had securely transmitted my complete forensic audit to my former director at the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS. The federal government does not wait for a public scandal to secure stolen assets. When they are handed airtight, absolute proof of massive commercial money laundering, they move with silent, terrifying speed. A federal judge had secretly signed a sweeping asset seizure warrant 48 hours prior to this exact moment. Trevor's offshore accounts, his corporate holdings, and his highly secure private safety deposit box had all been legally frozen and entirely emptied by federal agents while he was still sleeping comfortably in his bed 2 days ago. We sat in the car and waited for the inevitable conclusion. Deep underground, inside the highly secure vault room, Trevor was likely pressing his trembling thumb against the biometric scanner and turning his brass key to open his personal steel box. I could perfectly imagine the sheer absolute terror gripping his heart when he pulled the heavy metal drawer open, only to find it completely empty. There were no stacks of $100 bills. There were no digital hardware wallets containing untraceable cryptocurrency. There was absolutely nothing but cold, empty steel. And then the real nightmare would begin for him. The heavy armored doors of the bank lobby suddenly slid open. But it was not Trevor walking out with a duffel bag full of cash. A team of 4 men wearing dark tactical windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI printed across the back walked out into the cool night air. They were moving in a tight, highly trained formation. In the center of their group was Trevor. He was no longer the arrogant, abusive husband who had violently humiliated my daughter in a crowded restaurant. His expensive suit jacket was torn, his tie was missing, and his hands were pulled tightly behind his back, secured by heavy steel handcuffs. His head was bowed deeply in absolute defeat, and his shoulders shook with violent, uncontrollable sobs. The federal agents had been waiting quietly inside the subterranean vault room the entire time. They knew he would eventually come running for the stolen money the exact moment his house of cards collapsed. They simply waited in the shadows, let him open the empty box to completely break his spirit, and then stepped forward to place him under federal arrest. Trevor had walked willingly into a federal facility to access criminally obtained funds, automatically adding a massive bank fraud enhancement to his already extensive list of federal charges. The agents marched him across the wet sidewalk toward an unmarked black sport utility vehicle parked near the corner. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated his pale, terrified face through the rain. As they pushed him roughly toward the open back door of the vehicle, Trevor suddenly stopped and looked across the street. Even through the darkness and the rain, his desperate, searching eyes locked directly onto Aaron's parked car. He saw me sitting in the passenger seat, perfectly calm and completely untouched. He saw my daughter sitting in the back seat, her head held high, completely free from his absolute control. Trevor tried to plant his feet on the wet pavement, resisting the agents for just a fraction of a second. He opened his mouth to scream something at us across the empty street. Perhaps he wanted to beg for forgiveness, or perhaps he just wanted to curse my name. But the federal agents did not care what he had to say. One of the men placed a heavy hand firmly on the top of Trevor's head and shoved him forcefully into the back of the dark vehicle, slamming the heavy door shut and entirely cutting off his voice. The absolute silence of the wet street was restored. I did not smile, and I did not gloat. I simply watched the taillights of the federal vehicle fade into the distance, taking the monster entirely out of our lives forever. The rain continued to fall steadily as the federal agents pushed Trevor against the side of the dark sport utility vehicle. He was completely drenched, and his expensive tailored clothes clung awkwardly to his shivering frame. The slick, arrogant persona he had worn at the restaurant was entirely washed away, leaving nothing but a terrified, weak man. When he locked his wide, panicked eyes with mine across the wet pavement, his entire demeanor shifted from absolute terror to pathetic, desperate bargaining. He twisted his body, fighting against the heavy grip of the federal agents just long enough to shout my name into the cold night air. He was begging. The very same man who had violently assaulted my daughter in front of a crowded room and mocked her tears was now crying loudly like a frightened, helpless child. He screamed that none of this was his fault. His voice echoed down the empty financial district street as he desperately tried to rewrite history. He blamed his own father without a single second of hesitation. He claimed that Stephen had heavily manipulated him into taking the fraudulent commercial loans, and that Stephen was the true evil mastermind behind the charity money laundering scheme. Trevor yelled that he never actually wanted to hurt Natalie, and that he was only trying to follow his father's orders to build a successful life for them. It was the ultimate display of absolute cowardice. When the artificial financial power he had borrowed from his father finally evaporated, Trevor instantly threw the man who had raised him completely under the bus, hoping to save his own skin. During my 35 years auditing dangerous criminal syndicates, I had seen countless thieves turn on their own blood the exact moment the handcuffs came out. There is no loyalty among arrogant men who build their lives on stolen money. I did not sit safely inside the car and watch him cry from behind the glass. I opened the passenger door and stepped out onto the wet sidewalk. I did not care about the cold rain soaking my suit. I walked slowly to the edge of the curb, closing the distance between us until only a few yards of dark asphalt separated the hunter from the prey. The federal agents paused for a brief moment, recognizing my face from the massive forensic audit file I had securely transmitted to their director. They relaxed their grip just slightly, allowing me to have the final word. Trevor looked at me, his face pale and completely covered in rain and tears. He begged me to call the federal director and tell them it was all a massive misunderstanding. He frantically promised to give Natalie the beautiful house, the entire charity organization, and whatever clean money was left in his personal accounts if I just told the agents to let him walk away. I stood perfectly still and looked him dead in his terrified eyes. I did not raise my voice to compete with the sound of the falling rain or the ambient noise of the city. I spoke with a quiet, absolute finality that pierced straight through his pathetic, desperate lies. "You pulled her hair," I said, my voice completely void of any mercy or hesitation. "I pulled your life support." The sheer brutal truth of those words hit him far harder than any physical blow ever could. The last tiny sliver of hope completely drained from his face, leaving behind nothing but the hollow, terrifying realization of his permanent destruction. I offered him a single firm nod of goodbye. The lead federal agent immediately pushed Trevor forcefully into the back of the dark vehicle and slammed the heavy door shut, sealing him inside a dark, unforgiving world he would likely never leave. I stood on the curb and watched the red taillights of the federal convoy disappear down the slick city streets until they were completely swallowed by the darkness. The cancer had been entirely removed from our lives. I turned around and walked calmly back to Aaron's car. When I climbed into the passenger seat, Natalie reached forward from the back and wrapped her arms tightly around my neck, burying her face against my shoulder. She was crying again, but this time they were tears of profound, absolute relief. The crushing weight of the fraudulent debt, the terrifying psychiatric hold, and the years of quiet emotional abuse had all been instantly lifted from her shoulders. Aaron drove us away from the towering glass buildings of the financial district and guided the car back toward my quiet suburban neighborhood. The adrenaline that had fueled my calculated actions for the past 48 hours slowly began to fade, leaving behind a deep, heavy exhaustion in my bones. I felt the profound, satisfying peace of a father who had successfully protected his blood and restored absolute order to his family. We arrived at my house shortly after midnight. Aaron promised to handle all the complex federal depositions and legal paperwork in the morning before turning his car around and driving away into the night. Natalie went straight down the hallway to the guest bedroom, curling up under the heavy blankets, to finally get the safe, uninterrupted sleep she so desperately deserved. I walked into my private study, needing a few quiet moments to process the sheer magnitude of the evening. I poured myself a small glass of water and sat down heavily behind my solid oak desk. I believed the war was entirely over. I believed the arrogant men who had threatened my family were safely contained by the authorities. But I had severely underestimated the destructive, completely unpredictable power of a narcissistic man who has just lost absolutely everything. Stephen had not been immediately arrested by the federal authorities at the gala. The massive public scandal had caused total, absolute chaos in the ballroom, but the local police who responded to the riot were still deeply embedded in his corrupt political pocket. In the absolute confusion of the angry wealthy mob and the shattered hotel lobby, Stephen had utilized his final remaining political favors to slip through the cracks and evade capture. He knew his bank accounts were entirely frozen. He knew his son had been captured by the federal government at the vault. He knew his political career, his freedom, and his carefully constructed legacy were completely destroyed. He was a man backed entirely into a corner with absolutely nothing left to lose. As I sat in the dark silence of my study sipping my water, a sudden violent sound shattered the peace of my home. It was the loud, unmistakable crash of heavy glass shattering coming directly from the kitchen at the very back of the house. The heavy wooden back door was violently kicked open, splintering the doorframe into pieces. Heavy, frantic footsteps pounded aggressively against my hardwood floors, moving rapidly down the hallway. It was not a common burglar looking for loose jewelry or cash. It was Stephen. He had come to my home in the middle of the night, armed with a heavy weapon, driven entirely by a desperate, blinding thirst for final, ultimate vengeance. I did not jump out of my chair when the heavy wooden door of my study was violently kicked open. I simply set my glass of water down on the oak desk and folded my hands together, resting them quietly on the polished wood. Stephen stood in the doorway, and he was absolutely unrecognizable from the polished, arrogant politician who had stood on the gala stage just a few hours ago. His expensive white tuxedo jacket was completely soaked with heavy rain and stained with dark mud. His elegant silk bow tie hung loosely around his collar, and his face was bruised and severely scratched, likely from a desperate physical altercation with the angry mob of investors before he managed to escape the hotel lobby. He was breathing incredibly heavily, his chest heaving with extreme exertion, and the sharp metallic smell of pure adrenaline filled the quiet sanctuary of my room. But the most dangerous thing about him was not his wild, desperate eyes or his ruined clothes. It was the heavy black steel handgun gripped tightly in his shaking right hand, aimed directly at the center of my chest. He stepped fully into the study and kicked the heavy door shut behind him, sealing us inside the room. He did not ask for money or demand that I somehow fix the absolute financial ruin I had just caused him. He was far beyond the point of extortion or desperate negotiation. He had come to my home entirely for blood. He paced back and forth in front of my desk, waving the weapon erratically as he began to scream. He blamed me for absolutely everything that had gone wrong in his life. He screamed that I had single-handedly destroyed his immaculate 30-year political legacy and turned him into a hunted fugitive in his own city. He yelled that his beautiful son was currently sitting in a cold federal holding cell because of my malicious, unprovoked interference. He completely refused to take a single ounce of responsibility for the money laundering, the violent domestic abuse, or the massive federal fraud they had committed against my family. In his twisted, narcissistic mind, he was the tragic victim of a jealous, vindictive old man, and the heavy gun in his hand was his only remaining instrument of justice. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair, completely ignoring the barrel of the gun pointed at my heart. I did not flinch when he stepped closer and pressed the cold metal muzzle against the edge of my desk. I knew that the absolute worst thing a person can do when facing a desperate armed man is to show fear or attempt to physically fight back. If I panicked or begged for my life, it would give him the exact psychological power he was desperately craving before pulling the trigger. I also knew that my daughter was sleeping in the guest bedroom just down the hallway, and any sudden violent escalation could put her directly in his path. Instead, I maintained the exact same cold, calculating demeanor I had used during my decades of confronting violent cartel accountants. I looked at his shaking hand and then looked directly up into his bloodshot eyes. I kept my voice incredibly soft and completely devoid of emotion. I told him that pulling the trigger would not magically unfreeze his bank accounts or open the heavy steel doors of his son's federal prison cell. I told him that killing me would only guarantee that he spent the rest of his miserable life locked in a concrete box, entirely forgotten by the wealthy elite he had tried so incredibly hard to impress. Stephen let out a dark, bitter laugh that sounded more like a choked sob. He leaned heavily over the desk, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He whispered that he no longer cared about the money or the prestigious country club memberships. He told me that his life was already entirely over, and that he was simply here to make absolutely sure I did not get to enjoy the victory. He slowly pulled the heavy hammer of the gun back with a loud, ominous click, preparing to end the war he had so foolishly started. But right before his trembling finger could squeeze the trigger, I calmly raised my right hand and pointed a single steady finger toward the open laptop resting on the corner of my desk. I gently advised him to look closely at the small, glowing green light illuminated at the top of the dark monitor. Stephen paused, his eyes darting suspiciously toward the computer screen. He squinted in the dim light of the study, desperately trying to understand what he was looking at. I spoke very slowly, enunciating every single word, so the crushing reality of his situation would completely destroy whatever remaining fight he had left in his body. I explained that when I heard the glass shatter in my kitchen, I did not call the corrupt local police department to save me because I knew they worked for him. I simply hit a single hotkey on my encrypted computer. I told Stephen that the high-definition webcam staring directly at his face was currently broadcasting a highly secure live video and audio feed directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation Task Force Command Center. I explained that the very same federal agents who had arrested his son at the bank vault 30 minutes ago were currently sitting in a secure room watching him hold a loaded firearm to my chest in real time. To completely shatter his fabricated reality, I reached over and tapped the spacebar on the keyboard. The laptop speakers instantly crackled to life, and the stern, authoritative voice of the lead federal director filled my quiet study. The director addressed Stephen by his full legal name, ordering him to immediately drop the weapon and step away from the desk. The director confirmed that heavily armed federal tactical units had already surrounded the entire perimeter of my property, and that any sudden movement would result in immediate lethal force. The heavy black handgun suddenly looked like it weighed 1,000 pounds in Stephen's hand. The sheer, absolute magnitude of his profound failure completely washed over him. He realized that he had not successfully sneaked into my house like a clever predator to exact his final glorious revenge. He had simply walked directly onto a federally monitored stage and provided the government with the ultimate undeniable video evidence of attempted murder. All the fight and the false arrogance instantly drained from his body, leaving him entirely hollow and completely defeated. Stephen stood completely paralyzed in the center of my study. The stern voice of the federal director, echoing from the small laptop speakers, had entirely shattered the fragile, violent illusion he had brought into my home. He looked down at the heavy black handgun gripped tightly in his sweating hand, as if he suddenly had no idea how it got there. He had walked into this room fully believing he was the ultimate judge and executioner, ready to deliver his final, desperate vengeance against the man who had ruined him. But the glowing green light of the webcam proved he was nothing more than a pathetic, trapped rat, performing for a highly trained federal audience. The absolute silence in the room stretched for several agonizing seconds, broken only by his shallow, ragged breathing. He looked back up at me, his eyes wide with a profound, terrifying clarity. He finally understood that I had never been the helpless prey. I had always been the architect of his permanent destruction. Before Stephen could even attempt to formulate a desperate apology, the quiet suburban night was violently torn apart by the sound of approaching sirens. But these were not the standard high-pitched wails of the corrupt local county police department he was so entirely used to controlling and bribing. These were the deep, heavy, aggressive sirens of federal tactical armored vehicles rushing toward my property from every single direction. The sound grew deafeningly loud, within seconds, vibrating the glass window panes of my study and completely suffocating any remaining hope he might have held. The flashing red and blue lights pierced through the darkness outside, sweeping aggressively across the walls of my home and casting long, distorted shadows across his ruined white tuxedo. The heavy steel weapon simply became too incredibly heavy for his trembling fingers to hold. His hand opened slowly, and the gun slipped from his grasp, falling toward the floor. It hit the solid oak hardwood with a loud, heavy clatter, sliding harmlessly under the edge of my desk. The moment the weapon left his hand, the absolute last remaining ounce of artificial power completely drained from his body. His knees buckled beneath him entirely, unable to support the crushing weight of his massive federal failures. Stephen collapsed onto the floor of my study, landing heavily on his knees. He bowed his head completely, submitting to the inescapable reality of his situation. He did not cry, and he did not scream. He simply stared blankly at the wooden floorboards, a completely broken and utterly ruined man. I remained perfectly seated in my leather chair, my hands folded quietly on the desk. I did not stand up to mock him or deliver a dramatic final speech about justice. During my decades of hunting the worst financial predators in the world, I learned that the most devastating punishment you can inflict on a broken, arrogant man is absolute, total indifference. When you refuse to acknowledge their desperate surrender, you completely strip away their final shred of human dignity. I simply watched him kneel in the dirt of his own making, waiting patiently for the federal authorities to come and remove the trash from my home. The tactical breach was incredibly fast and overwhelmingly aggressive. I heard the heavy, frantic stomping of tactical boots flooding through the shattered back door of my kitchen. Powerful flashlight beams sliced fiercely through the dark hallway leading toward my study, accompanied by the loud, authoritative shouts of heavily armed men coordinating their entry. Less than 10 seconds after Stephen had dropped his weapon, my study door was shoved completely open. 5 federal agents wearing thick ballistic vests and carrying heavy tactical rifles swarmed into the small room. Bright, blinding laser sights danced aggressively across Stephen's chest and back. They did not treat him like a respected city councilman or a wealthy country club elite. They treated him exactly like the highly dangerous armed federal fugitive he had chosen to become. 2 massive agents immediately grabbed Stephen by his shoulders and threw him face down onto the hardwood floor with absolute brutal efficiency. One agent planted a heavy tactical boot firmly against the back of his neck, pinning him securely to the ground, while another violently wrenched his arms behind his back. The loud, harsh ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists echoed sharply through the room. A third agent quickly kicked the dropped handgun far out of reach, securing the immediate area. Stephen did not offer a single ounce of physical resistance. He lay flat on the floor, completely limp, letting the federal agents manhandle him as if he were nothing more than a heavy sack of useless garbage. They hauled him roughly to his feet, his ruined white tuxedo now covered in the dust and dirt from my floor. They did not read him his rights in the comfort of my home or offer him a moment to collect himself. The lead agent simply grabbed him by the back of his collar and marched him forcefully out of my study. I listened to the heavy thud of their boots as they dragged him down the hallway and out through the shattered kitchen door. I heard the loud metallic slam of the armored vehicle door closing securely in my driveway, entirely trapping the corrupt politician inside his new permanent reality. The heavy sirens flared up once again, slowly fading away into the distance as the federal convoy transported him directly toward a maximum security holding facility. The sudden absolute silence that returned to my house was incredibly profound. The flashing tactical lights disappeared from my walls, leaving the study bathed only in the soft, warm glow of my brass desk lamp. I looked back at the computer monitor. The federal director was still on the secure, encrypted feed watching the empty room. The director spoke quietly, confirming that the entire perimeter was completely secure, the weapon was recovered, and the armed threat was permanently neutralized. I nodded silently to the screen, thanking the director for his incredibly swift assistance. I reached out and gently closed the laptop, bringing the long, terrifying night to an absolute and final close. The war was officially over, and the arrogant men who had tried to break my daughter were finally locked away exactly where they belonged. It has been exactly 6 months since the long, terrifying night ended in my quiet suburban study. The federal justice system can often move slowly, but it grinds forward with an absolute terrifying certainty when the evidence is completely undeniable. Stephen and Trevor did not even attempt to fight the massive charges against them in a long, drawn-out public trial. Faced with the crystal-clear audio recordings, the legally verified digital footprints, the seized charity ledgers, and the live streaming broadcast of an armed federal assault, they both realized their war was entirely over. They accepted incredibly harsh federal plea deals simply to avoid spending the rest of their natural lives fighting a losing battle behind bars. Stephen, the arrogant, corrupt city councilman, who once believed he owned our entire town, is currently serving a 20-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He has been completely stripped of his political titles, his stolen wealth, and his deeply fabricated prestige. The man who wore custom-tailored suits and drank expensive champagne now wears a standard orange jumpsuit and sleeps on a thin mattress in a tiny concrete box. He spends his days entirely surrounded by the very same type of dangerous, violent criminals he once pretended to protect the city from. Trevor was sent to a completely different federal facility located across the country, serving a mandatory 15-year sentence for aggravated identity theft and massive commercial wire fraud. He will spend the absolute best years of his adult life locked behind heavy steel doors, completely isolated from the luxury and the unearned privilege he once demanded from the world. He has no access to corporate credit cards, no expensive trucks to drive, and no innocent wife to bully and control. They are no longer a powerful father and son duo operating completely above the law. They are just two assigned inmate numbers serving hard time for their incredible greed. Their entire legacy has been entirely erased from the county history books. The massive predatory commercial loan that Trevor had illegally forged against my daughter's home was entirely voided by a federal judge during the asset recovery hearings. The predatory bank that authorized the fraudulent transaction without proper identity verification was forced to absorb the massive financial loss, and Natalie's pristine credit score was completely restored by the court. But my daughter did not simply return to her old quiet life. The profound trauma she endured could have easily broken a weaker person entirely, destroying their ability to ever trust another human being again. Instead, Natalie used the intense pain of that ultimate betrayal to forge an entirely new, powerful version of herself. She legally finalized her absolute divorce from Trevor without him ever being permitted to step foot inside a county courtroom. She completely reorganized her nonprofit charity, implementing incredibly strict financial safeguards and independent third-party auditing protocols to ensure her organization could never be compromised again. The wealthy donors and the influential socialites from the charity gala who had panicked that night eventually returned to her doorstep. Once they fully realized that Natalie was the true innocent victim and the brave, resilient woman who helped expose a massive municipal corruption ring, they flooded her community programs with unprecedented levels of financial support. Today, she is absolutely no longer the quiet, timid wife who lowers her eyes and stays silent when a loud, arrogant man speaks. She is a powerful, confident executive director who commands immediate respect in every single room she enters. Her community centers are completely fully operational, providing safe, warm havens and essential educational resources to hundreds of vulnerable children across the entire city. She took the absolute worst emotional and financial betrayal a woman could possibly experience and transformed it directly into a massive force for profound public good. I regularly watch her interact with her dedicated staff and her grateful volunteers, and the overwhelming pride I feel in my chest is entirely indescribable. She completely broke the heavy invisible chains of domestic emotional abuse and built an absolute fortress of independence and lasting strength. I am sitting on the wooden deck of my back porch right now, holding a warm ceramic cup of coffee and watching the early morning sun rise over the quiet green trees in my neighborhood. The violently shattered back door of my kitchen was replaced many months ago, and the deep, aggressive scratches on my hardwood floors have been entirely sanded away and polished. The physical, violent scars of our brief, intense war have been completely erased from my home. I am 70 years old, and my long, stressful days of hunting dangerous financial predators for the government are now truly and permanently behind me. I do not wear a hidden recording device pinned to my collar anymore. I do not spend my late nights staring at encrypted computer screens tracking stolen money across complex international borders. My final ultimate audit was a complete and total success. Order has been fully restored to our lives. The predators who tried to consume us have been entirely removed from society, and the innocent people they tried to destroy are now thriving beyond measure. I protected my blood, and I secured my daughter's future against a deeply corrupt world. Sometimes the most dangerous monsters do not hide in dark city alleys or operate out of foreign countries. Sometimes they sit right across from you at a fancy dinner table, smiling warmly, while they slowly drain your entire life away. But a true family protects its own against any threat, regardless of the personal cost or the terrible risks involved. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my story today. If you found any strength or inspiration in this long journey, please let me know what city you are listening from in the comments below. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel for more true life stories, and always remember to stand up and fight for the people you love.